I'm Amelia now. People see the silver in my hair, the calm in my voice, the way I smile like I've already made peace with life. But when I close my eyes at night,
I still remember being 19.
19 is a dangerous age. You think you know everything, but your heart is still unguarded, wide open, hungry. I didn't know then that one person could change the entire direction of a life. I only knew that something inside me woke up the day I met him. It was summer, the kind of summer that makes your skin feel alive. The air smelled warm, heavy with dust and distant laughter. I remember the way my dress clung to me that afternoon, how I kept adjusting it without knowing why. Maybe some part of me already sensed that my life was about to split into before and after. He wasn't loud. He didn't try to impress anyone. That's what drew me in first. He looked at me like I was already someone important, even before I knew who I was myself. When our eyes met, I felt it, not fireworks, not drama, something slower and more dangerous. Recognition. We talked like old friends who had just found each other again after years apart. He asked questions no one had ever asked me. Not polite ones. Real ones. What do you want, Amelia? Not what are you studying, not where are you from, but what do you want? No one had ever cared enough to ask. When he leaned closer, so I could hear him over the noise, I felt my breath change. My body reacted before my mind did. His presence wasn't rushed. It was patient, like he knew exactly how much space to leave between us, just enough to make me aware of it. I went home that night, unable to sleep. I replayed his voice in my head, the way he said my name.
Slowly, carefully.
Like it mattered. At 19, every feeling feels like the first feeling. Every touch you imagine feels electric. Every possibility feels infinite. When we met again, it felt inevitable, like something pulling us together quietly, steadily. We walked side by side, our arms brushing just barely enough to send heat through me. Neither of us moved away. I remember the moment our fingers finally touched. Not accidentally. Deliberately. It wasn't dramatic. It was intimate. I looked up at him, and for a second the world narrowed to just us. The way his thumb rested against my hand. The way my heart was beating too fast, betraying me. The way I suddenly felt seen, not as a girl, but as a woman discovering herself. That was the beginning. Not of love the way people talk about it in movies, but of love that teaches you who you are. Love that leaves marks, not on the body but on the soul. And I didn't know yet that the choices I was about to make at 19 would echo through every decade that followed. I didn't tell anyone about him at first. Some things feel too fragile to share, like they might disappear if spoken out loud. At 19, I guarded my feelings the way people guard secrets they're not ready to explain. We began meeting in small, ordinary places that slowly became sacred to me. A quiet cafe with chipped cups. A park bench under a tree that offered just enough shade. Places where nothing dramatic happened, yet everything inside me was changing. He listened. Really listened. Not the way people wait for their turn to speak, but the way someone studies the details of you, your pauses, your half-finished thoughts, the things you almost say, and then pull back. When I talked about my fears, he didn't dismiss them. When I talked about my dreams, he didn't laugh. At 19, that kind of attention feels intoxicating. Sometimes he would look at me for a moment too long before speaking, and I would feel heat rise under my skin. Not embarrassment, awareness. I became aware of my own body in a way I never had before. The way I crossed my legs. The way I leaned closer, without meaning to. The way silence between us felt charged instead of awkward. There were moments when the world seemed to pause just to watch us breathe. One evening, we walked slowly through a street glowing with warm lights. The air was cooler, brushing against my arms. I remember how close he walked to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth from his body without touching him. That space between us became unbearable. When he finally stopped walking and turned toward me, I knew something was about to happen. My heart was loud in my chest. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He lifted his hand slowly, giving me time to step away. I didn't. His fingers brushed a loose strand of my hair behind my ear, and the gesture felt impossibly intimate. Not because it was bold, but because it was careful, respectful. Like he understood exactly how new all of this was to me. At 19, you don't yet know the difference between attention and affection. But I was learning. When our lips finally met, it wasn't hunger, it was curiosity. A quiet exploration. The kind of kiss that asks permission instead of taking. My knees felt weak afterward, and I laughed softly, embarrassed by how deeply it affected me. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, my fingers resting on my own lips like they could still feel him there. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into something that felt dangerously close to forever. My world began to orbit around moments with him. I dressed differently. I walked differently. I felt older, not hardened, but awakened. We talked about everything. About his past. About my childhood. About who we thought we might become. Sometimes those conversations grew quiet, heavy with things neither of us could change. I didn't realize then that love doesn't always arrive to stay. Sometimes it arrives to teach. There were nights we sat close enough that my head rested against his shoulder, his arm loose around me, protective but never possessive. I learned how powerful restraint could be, how desire could live in the smallest gestures, a hand on the small of my back, a breath against my neck, the way he said my name when he thought I wasn't listening. At 19, those moments carve themselves into you. I felt beautiful around him. Not because he said it constantly, but because he treated me like I was. That confidence stayed with me long after he didn't. But love at 19 doesn't come without fear. I began to sense cracks beneath the surface. Responsibilities he never spoke about. Decisions looming ahead of him that didn't include me. I pretended not to notice, because at that age, you believe love can outrun reality. I was wrong. Still, I gave myself fully, emotionally, innocently, bravely, because I didn't yet know how to hold back. And maybe that's the point of first love. Not to last forever, but to show you how deeply you can feel. Even now, decades later, I can still remember the way my heart raced when I heard his footsteps behind me. The way my breath caught when he touched my hand. The way 19 felt like standing on the edge of a life you hadn't lived yet. And I didn't know then that the deepest lessons were still ahead of me. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. Love rarely breaks loudly. It softens first. Quietly. It teaches you to accept less without noticing when it began. I started sensing distance in the pauses between his words. In the way his smile arrived a second too late. In how his hand still held mine, but with a gentleness that felt like hesitation instead of certainty. At 19, you don't have language for these things yet. You only have feelings, confusing, heavy feelings you don't know how to name. I told myself I was imagining it. We still met, still talked, still shared that closeness that felt like oxygen. But something invisible had changed. The silence between us grew longer, thicker, like a question neither of us wanted to ask. One evening, we sat together in a dimly lit room, the kind of quiet where every small sound feels amplified. My leg was pressed against his, my body leaning into him the way it always had. I waited for him to pull me closer. He didn't. That small absence hit harder than any argument could have. I shifted slightly, pretending to adjust myself, pretending not to notice the ache spreading through my chest. At 19, pride and fear walk hand in hand. When he finally wrapped his arm around me, it felt deliberate, almost careful. Like he was holding something fragile he wasn't sure he could keep. I rested my head against his shoulder anyway. I always did. I wanted to memorize him while I still could. The warmth of his body. The slow rise and fall of his breath. The way his fingers rested against my arm without moving. That night, intimacy wasn't about touch.
It was about restraint.
About everything we didn't say pressing against us. Heavy and unresolved.
I wanted to ask him what had changed.
I didn't. Because when you're 19, you fear the answer more than the silence. Days later, I caught him watching me with something that looked like sadness. Not longing, resignation. As if he already knew the ending, and I was still reading the middle of the story with hope. "Amelia," he said one afternoon, his voice softer than usual. You're stronger than you think. I laughed it off, but the words stayed with me. They didn't sound like reassurance. They sounded like preparation. The boldness between us intensified in strange ways. The looks lasted longer. The touches lingered just a second more, as if we were both trying to absorb as much of each other as possible, without acknowledging why. Desire doesn't disappear when love is threatened. It sharpens. There were moments when the tension between us felt unbearable. When his hand rested on my thigh just long enough to make my breath hitch, then moved away. When our faces came close, lips almost touching, only for him to pull back slowly, deliberately. That restraint burned. At 19, you don't understand that sometimes passion isn't about what happens, it's about what almost does. One night, we stood close in the doorway, the air heavy, charged. His hands rested on my waist, firm now, grounding. I looked up at him, my heart pounding, my body fully aware of his. For a moment, I thought he might finally close the distance completely. Instead, he pressed his forehead against mine, breathing me in like a goodbye he wasn't ready to say. I felt tears sting my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I swallowed them back, refusing to let him see how deeply he had reached inside me. I don't want to hurt you, he whispered. That was the moment I knew. At 19, heartbreak doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, dressed as concern, wrapped in soft words and careful gestures. It tells you it loves you while it's already leaving. I didn't beg. I didn't argue. Some part of me understood that love can't be held hostage by emotion. That night, I kissed him slowly, deliberately, pouring everything I couldn't say into that one moment. He kissed me back with the same intensity, not desperation, but reverence. We stood there, suspended between what we had been and what we were about to lose. When he finally stepped away, I felt colder than I ever had before. I walked home alone, my body still warm from him, my heart aching with the knowledge that some loves don't end because they fail, they end because life demands a different path. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, not because I regretted loving him, but because I knew I would never be 19 again. I would never love with that kind of innocence, that kind of fearless abandon. And yet, even now, telling you this as Auntie Amelia, I don't speak his name with bitterness. Because he didn't just break my heart. He showed me its depth. And the story wasn't finished yet. After he stepped out of my life, the world didn't stop. That surprised me the most. The sun still rose. People still laughed. Streets still filled with noise. At 19, heartbreak feels like it should come with a pause button. Like the universe should acknowledge what you've lost. But it doesn't. I carried him with me quietly. In the way I hesitated before answering questions. In the way I flinched when someone new stood too close. In the way my body remembered intimacy, even when my heart tried to forget it. For a long time, I told myself it was over. That I was stronger now. That first love was just a chapter, important, yes, but finished. That's the lie we tell ourselves so we can keep moving. Then one evening, months later, I saw him again. It wasn't planned. It never is. I was walking through a familiar street, lost in my thoughts, when I felt it before I saw him, that old tightening in my chest, that instinctive awareness. Some connections never really disappear. They wait. He looked different. Tired, maybe. Older. Or maybe I was the one who had changed. Our eyes met, and for a second neither of us moved. Time folded in on itself. 19 rushed back into my veins like it had been waiting for permission. We spoke carefully, like two people handling something fragile. He asked how I was. I said I was fine. We both knew it wasn't the full truth. We walked together for a while. Not close like before. Not distant either. That space between us was different now, filled with everything we hadn't lived, everything we had almost been. The tension returned instantly. Sharper this time. More dangerous. Because now we both knew what we were risking. When we stopped near a quiet corner, he looked at me the way he used to. Openly, honestly, without hiding the pull between us. My body reacted before my mind could argue. At 19, Desire doesn't forget just because love was interrupted. I think about you, he admitted quietly. Those words unraveled something inside me. Not because they promised anything, but because they acknowledged what I had tried to bury. I felt heat rise under my skin, felt my breath shorten. I hated how easily he could still reach me. I stepped closer, close enough to feel him again, close enough that restraint became effort instead of instinct. His hand hovered near my waist, unsure, asking without words. That hesitation was everything. It gave me power.
Choice.
I didn't pull away. That closeness wasn't reckless. It was intense, deliberate, aching. We stood there, breathing each other in, neither of us pretending anymore. The air between us felt heavy, thick with memory and possibility. This time, when we kissed, it was different.
Slower. Deeper.
Less innocent. I knew myself now. I knew what I wanted. My hands rested against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath, grounding myself in the reality of the moment. At 19, learning that you can want someone without surrendering yourself is a revelation. We didn't cross lines that night, but we stood close enough that every nerve in my body felt awake. Desire doesn't need to be acted upon to be powerful. Sometimes it's strongest when held back, when both people are fully aware of what they're choosing not to do. When we finally parted, it felt like a second goodbye, gentler, but heavier. We both understood that love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means recognizing what a moment was meant to be and letting it remain that way. I went home changed again. Not broken this time. Wiser. I began to understand that the boldness of love isn't in how much you give away, it's in knowing when to hold on to yourself. That realization didn't come easily. It came through longing, through restraint, through nights spent replaying conversations and touches that never quite happened. Over time, other people entered my life. Some stayed briefly. Some left marks of their own. But none of them erased him. They didn't need to. He had already done his work. At 19, he showed me how deeply I could feel. In my 20s, I learned how to survive it. In my 30s, I learned how to choose better. And now, as Auntie Amelia, I understand why that love mattered. Because first love doesn't define who you end up with. It defines how honestly you open your heart afterward. And if you're listening closely, you'll hear that my story still isn't finished. Time softened the sharpest edges of that love, but it never erased its shape. It settled into me like a memory my body understood even when my mind was busy building a future. At 19, I thought love was something that happened to you. Later, I learned it's also something you carry quietly, faithfully, even when life moves on. I grew into myself after him. Not all at once. Slowly. Through mistakes that taught me my boundaries. Through nights when I learned the difference between being wanted and being chosen. I dated. I laughed. I pretended sometimes that I was untouched by that first deep imprint. But there were moments, always unexpected, when a song, a scent, a certain kind of silence would pull me back. I remember one winter evening, years later, standing by a window while snow traced soft lines against the glass. I felt peaceful. Truly peaceful. And that was when I realized the love I'd known at 19 had finally changed shape. It no longer ached. It warmed. It reminded me of who I had been when everything felt possible. What people don't tell you is that first love teaches your body a language your heart never forgets. It teaches you how closeness feels. How desire can be both gentle and commanding. How restraint can be as intimate as touch. I didn't know then that those lessons would guide me, sometimes save me, later in life. There were bold moments, too. Moments when I dared myself to want again. When I let someone stand close enough to feel my breath catch. When I allowed that familiar tension to build, not out of fear this time, but out of curiosity. I learned that intimacy isn't measured by how far you go, but by how present you are while you're there. At 19, I had confused intensity for permanence. Now I understood intensity can be temporary and still meaningful. I married once, loved deeply, imperfectly, built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and felt earned from within. There were joys, There were disappointments. There were nights of laughter that healed old wounds and mornings that reminded me why I stayed. Life layered itself over that first love without erasing it. And sometimes, late at night, I would think of him, not with longing but with gratitude, because he taught me to listen to my instincts, to recognize when attention was real, to know when desire was mutual, respectful, alive. I became Auntie Amelia somewhere along the way. The woman younger people came to for advice they pretended not to need. I learned how to smile knowingly without explaining everything. How to let stories rest until someone was ready to hear them. Now, when I tell you about being 19, I don't tell it to relive the ache. I tell it because that version of me was brave. She loved without armor. She stood in the heat of her own feelings and didn't turn away. There is a boldness in that kind of youth, not reckless, not naive, but open, vulnerable,
Alive.
and if you're listening closely, you'll hear it beneath my calm voice. The heartbeat of a girl who once believed love could change everything, and was right, just not in the way she expected. Because love did change my life. It taught me how to feel, how to choose, how to remain soft without being weak. And the night is still long. There is still more to tell. As I grew older, I realized that memory doesn't age the way the body does. It stays 19 forever, vivid, warm, sharp in unexpected places. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the world finally loosens its grip, I sit with a cup of tea and let that younger version of me breathe again. She was bold in ways I didn't recognize at the time. Not loud, not reckless. Bold in the way she allowed herself to feel without apology. She didn't dilute her emotions to make them easier for others to handle. She didn't negotiate with her heart. She trusted it. That trust shaped everything that came after. There were men who wanted me because I was kind, because I was steady, because I made life feel simpler. And there were men who wanted me because I was alive, because something in me sparked when I was seen fully. I learned to tell the difference. Slowly. Through trial and error. Through moments where desire pulled at me, and I had to ask myself whether it was pulling me forward or holding me back. Sometimes, desire came softly. A glance held just a moment too long. A conversation that dipped below the surface and stayed there. A hand brushing mine, and not pulling away. I learned to enjoy the build of those moments, to let tension exist without rushing to resolve it. That was something I learned from him, from us, without even realizing it. Other times, desire came with urgency, with heat, with a reminder that the body remembers what the mind has learned to live without. Those moments didn't scare me anymore. I understood them. I respected them. I didn't mistake them for promises. At 19, I had thought love was about surrender. Later, I learned it's also about discernment. I carried myself differently after that first heartbreak. I noticed it in the way I walked into rooms, in how I held eye contact, in how I didn't shrink when someone looked at me with interest. Confidence, real confidence, doesn't come from being adored. It comes from knowing you are capable of being deeply affected and surviving it. There were nights when intimacy unfolded slowly, carefully, with mutual awareness. Nights when closeness wasn't about urgency, but about presence. When someone leaned in and paused, waiting for my response, and I recognized the power in that pause. I chose when to step forward. I chose when to stop. That choice was everything. People assume first love is something you grow out of. I don't believe that. I think you grow through it. It becomes a foundation, sometimes cracked, sometimes uneven, but strong enough to support who you become. As Auntie Amelia, I've listened to countless confessions. Younger voices whispering questions they're afraid to ask out loud. How do you know when it's real? How do you let go? How do you open your heart again without losing yourself? I never give them simple answers. Life doesn't work that way. Instead, I tell them about 19. About loving someone who didn't stay. About learning that intensity doesn't guarantee permanence, and that absence doesn't erase impact. I tell them that romance isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about the quiet understanding between two people standing close, aware of what they could do, and choosing carefully. And I tell them this. If love changes you, it was real. even if it didn't last. The truth is, parts of me are still becoming, still learning, still open. Age doesn't close the door on desire or connection, it refines it. It teaches you which moments are worth stepping into fully and which are meant to be appreciated from the edge. Tonight, as I speak to you, I'm not mourning what was lost. I'm honoring what was lived. That girl at 19 didn't waste her heart. She invested it. And the return has lasted a lifetime. The night is deep. The story is still unfolding. And I'm still here, remembering, choosing, feeling, just a little wiser now, but no less alive. There are moments, even now, when I catch my reflection and recognize traces of that girl. Not in the smoothness of skin or the softness of youth, but in the eyes. The eyes remember everything. They remember how it felt to be seen for the first time, to feel wanted without being owned, to stand at the edge of something powerful and step forward anyway. At 19, I learned that attraction isn't just physical. It's intellectual, emotional, energetic. It's the way someone listens to you like you're the only sound in the room. It's the way your body responds before you've decided how to feel about it. It's the way silence can feel louder than words. I didn't talk about those things back then. Girls weren't encouraged to name their desires, only to manage them. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. I had learned that wanting didn't make me weak. It made me honest. There were times later in life when I felt that same familiar pull again. Not identical, nothing ever is, but similar enough to wake old instincts. A slow conversation that stretched late into the night. A shared laugh that lingered. A hand resting near mine. Not touching, but aware. I recognized the signs now. I knew how dangerous and beautiful that edge could be. And I didn't rush it. Because the older you get, the more you understand that intimacy is layered. There is the surface, smiles, flirtation, curiosity. And then there is the deeper current beneath, the part that asks, is this safe? Is this mutual? Is this worth opening myself again? At 19, I hadn't known to ask those questions. I had simply felt.
Deeply.
Fully. Without calculation. That's why that love stayed with me. I remember one particular night from that time, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. We were sitting close, the room quiet, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. His knee brushed mine, and neither of us moved away. My heartbeat felt loud, exposed. I was aware of every inch of space between us. Every breath. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt myself being chosen in that moment, not permanently, not forever, but completely. And that was enough. More than enough. I didn't understand then how rare that feeling is. Years later, I would recognize it when it appeared again, that sense of mutual awareness, of two people fully present, fully accountable for the effect they had on each other. That's the kind of connection that leaves an imprint, whether it lasts a night or a lifetime. As Auntie Amelia, I don't romanticize pain. I don't tell this story to glorify heartbreak. I tell it because love, even unfinished love, shapes you. It teaches you what you respond to, what you refuse to settle for, what kind of closeness makes you feel more yourself instead of less. The girl I was at 19 didn't know how strong she was. She only knew how deeply she could feel. And maybe that's strength enough at that age. I've learned since then that boldness isn't about crossing boundaries, it's about recognizing them and choosing when to lean in. It's about letting desire exist without letting it consume you. It's about staying open without abandoning yourself. And that lesson began there. In that summer. In those quiet moments charged with possibility. In that love that didn't stay, but never truly left either. I still carry her with me. That girl who stood on the threshold of her own becoming, heart open, eyes bright, unaware of how much she was about to learn. And I'm not finished telling you about her yet. There is a moment in every life when memory stops being something you visit and becomes something that visits you. It arrives uninvited, usually when you are calm, when you think you've already made peace with everything that shaped you. For me, it often came late at night. I would be sitting alone, the house finally quiet, and suddenly I would feel 19 again, not confused, not broken, but awake. Fully awake. as if that younger version of me was gently tapping on the inside of my chest, reminding me where my courage was born. At 19, I learned that attraction could be gentle and overwhelming at the same time. That desire didn't always need to rush forward to be powerful. Sometimes it lived in pauses, in restraint, in the way someone chose not to touch you because they respected how much it would mean if they did. That understanding followed me into adulthood. I noticed it in the way I responded to closeness later in life. I no longer mistook intensity for urgency. I could sit with longing without panicking. I could let someone stand near me, feel the heat of possibility, and still breathe. That was growth. There were men who tried to rush me after that, who thought boldness meant speed, who believed attraction was something to claim quickly before it slipped away. I never stayed long with those men. My body knew the difference now. My instincts had been trained by a love that moved slowly, deliberately, with intention. Sometimes I wondered if he knew that, if he knew how deeply he had shaped me without ever realizing it. Years after our last meeting, I dreamed of him once. Not in a dramatic way. Not in longing or regret. We were simply sitting together, calm, older, talking like two people who had shared something important and survived it. I woke up with a sense of closure I hadn't known I was missing. That dream didn't reopen wounds. It sealed them. At 19, I thought love was something that happened once, like a lightning strike. Later, I learned it's more like a current. It flows differently at different stages of your life. Sometimes strong and fast. Sometimes slow and deep. But always present if you're willing to feel it. I became more selective as the years passed. Not colder, just clearer. I stopped explaining myself to people who couldn't meet me where I stood. I stopped shrinking my emotions to make them easier to digest. I had learned that my depth wasn't a flaw. It was a gift, just not everyone knew how to receive it. And yes, there were bold moments along the way. Moments when attraction pulled tight between two people who understood exactly what they were doing. Moments when a look carried history, possibility, restraint, and desire all at once. Moments where intimacy lived in breath, in proximity, in awareness. Those moments didn't need to be loud to be unforgettable. I learned that the most powerful kind of romance isn't about what you take from someone. It's about what you awaken in each other. Confidence, curiosity, courage, presence. That's what he gave me at 19. Not a promise, not a future, but an awakening. Now, when younger people listen to my stories, they sometimes ask if I wish it had ended differently. If I wish he had stayed. If I regret how much I felt. I never do. Because regret comes from wishing you had lived less honestly. And I lived that love honestly, with openness, vulnerability, and bravery. I didn't know then that life would ask more of me later. That it would demand strength I hadn't yet developed. That it would teach me loss, patience, compromise, resilience. But it also gave me the tools to face all of that. Those tools were forged at 19. In longing, in restraint, in desire tempered by respect, in love that didn't last but mattered. I am Auntie Amelia now. I speak calmly. I move steadily. I choose carefully. But inside me lives a girl who once stood in the heat of her own becoming and didn't turn away. And as long as she's still there, this story still has more to give. There's a strange kindness that comes with age. Not the softening kind people talk about, but a clarity that strips things down to what mattered most. When I look back now, I don't remember exact dates or places as sharply as I remember how my body felt. How my chest tightened before I understood why. How my breath slowed when I felt safe. How certain moments lingered in my skin long after they passed. At 19, everything was physical and emotional at the same time. I didn't yet know how to separate the two. A look could make my pulse jump. A voice could settle me. Presence itself could feel intimate. I was learning the language of closeness without realizing it had a grammar. That's why that period shaped me so deeply. After him, I noticed I no longer disappeared into relationships. I stayed present inside myself. Even when I wanted someone, even when desire stirred and pulled at me, there was a part of me that remained observant, grounded. That balance didn't make love weaker. It made it truer. I remember a man I met years later, someone kind and attentive. He touched my hand once, gently, and I felt that familiar awareness spark, not overwhelming, but unmistakable. He paused, waiting. That pause told me more about him than any words could have. I smiled then, recognizing the power of that moment. The power of choice. I chose slowly. That's something 19 taught me too, that not choosing immediately is a form of strength. That wanting doesn't obligate you to give yourself away. That desire can exist alongside dignity. Sometimes I wonder what my younger self would think if she could see me now. Would she recognize the woman I became? Would she be proud that I didn't harden, that I didn't shut down, that I kept my heart open even after it had learned how much it could hurt? I think she would. Because the girl at 19 didn't just fall in love, she learned how to listen to herself. She learned what her body responded to when it felt respected. She learned the difference between being pursued and being understood. Those lessons stayed with me in quiet ways. In how I taught my children about boundaries without fear. In how I spoke to younger women who were afraid their feelings were too much. In how I modeled affection that didn't demand or consume. I told them that boldness doesn't mean recklessness. It means honesty. It means acknowledging what you feel without letting it erase who you are. There were nights in my 20s and 30s when attraction flared unexpectedly, catching me off guard. A shared glance, a late conversation, a warmth that lingered just beneath the surface. I never panicked anymore. I recognized the sensation, welcomed it, and asked myself what it wanted to teach me. Sometimes it taught me desire still lived in me. Sometimes it taught me restraint. Sometimes it reminded me I was still alive in ways age could never dull. That's the gift of loving deeply when you're young. If you survive it intact, it becomes a compass. I don't speak of him often by name. Not because he doesn't deserve it, but because the story was never about him alone. It was about who I became in his presence. Who I discovered myself to be when someone saw me clearly and stepped back instead of taking advantage. That respect mattered more than passion ever could. As Auntie Amelia, I sit with this knowledge gently now. I don't rush my memories. I let them surface when they're ready. I let them breathe. Because some stories aren't meant to be told all at once. They unfold the way love does, layer by layer, moment by moment. And I'm still here. Still remembering.
Still choosing.
Still honoring that girl who once stood at 19, heart open, unaware of how far that openness would carry her. There is more ahead, and I haven't finished yet. There is a quiet confidence that settles into you when you stop fearing your own emotions. I didn't have that at 19. What I had instead was courage, raw, unpolished, instinctive. And sometimes I think courage is more powerful than confidence ever could be. Back then, I didn't analyze my feelings. I lived inside them. When something pulled at me, I followed the pull. When closeness made my skin warm and my thoughts blur, I didn't ask whether it was sensible. I asked whether it was honest. That kind of honesty leaves marks, not scars, but imprints. It changes how you move through the world afterward. I remember how aware I became of myself during that time. Of how I stood when someone watched me, of how my voice softened without intention, of how silence felt when it was shared instead of empty. At 19, I began to understand that intimacy starts long before touch. It begins in attention, in recognition, in the way someone stays present instead of distracted. That awareness followed me everywhere. Even years later, I could feel when a moment was shifting from ordinary into something charged. The air would feel heavier. Conversations would slow. Words would carry more weight than they needed to. I learned not to be afraid of those moments. I learned to sit inside them without rushing forward or pulling away. That balance came from loving someone who didn't stay. I didn't chase closure after him. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I sensed that some connections complete themselves without explanation. They arrive, awaken something, and then step back, leaving you changed but intact. At 19, I thought endings had to be dramatic to be real. Later, I learned the quiet ones last longer. There were evenings when I caught myself smiling at nothing, remembering how it felt to be looked at with intention. To feel desired without being reduced. To feel chosen without being claimed. That kind of desire doesn't fade easily. It matures. It becomes discerning. When I eventually loved again, truly loved, it was different. Slower.
Deeper.
Built on mutual presence rather than intensity alone. But I recognized the foundation immediately.
The same respect.
The same awareness. The same restraint that made closeness feel meaningful instead of overwhelming. That's how I knew I was ready. People often assume the boldest chapters of your life happen when you're young. I don't agree. Youth is bold because it doesn't yet know restraint. But true boldness comes later, when you know exactly what you're risking and choose to feel anyway. Still, 19 was where I learned how powerful feeling could be. I learned how a look could steady you. How a pause could speak louder than touch. How wanting didn't mean losing control. Those lessons became part of my body's memory. They shaped how I allowed myself to be held, how I allowed myself to hold back, how I recognized when something was mutual and when it wasn't. I became gentler with myself because of that love. I stopped punishing myself for wanting. I stopped apologizing for depth. I stopped believing that softness was weakness. Now, when I speak as Auntie Amelia, my voice carries calm, but it also carries truth. I don't tell young people to protect their hearts by closing them. I tell them to protect their hearts by knowing themselves, by recognizing when something feels respectful, mutual, alive. Because love that changes you doesn't always stay, and love that stays doesn't always change you. The love I had at 19 did both, in its own way. And even now, as the years continue to layer themselves gently over my life, I can still feel her inside me. That girl. That openness. That willingness to stand close to something powerful and not look away. I'm still walking with her. Still listening to her. Still letting the story unfold. There are seasons in life when you don't realize you're being shaped until much later, when you look back and recognize the outline of who you became. 19 was that season for me. It didn't announce itself as important. It just was. And that's what made it powerful. Back then, I didn't have language for boundaries, for emotional intelligence, for self-respect. I learned them through feeling, through moments when my chest tightened and I didn't know whether it was excitement or fear. Through closeness that made me feel taller instead of smaller. Through distance that taught me how much I valued presence. I learned that intimacy isn't something you take, it's something you allow. That lesson stayed with me. It showed up later in my friendships, in my marriage, in the way I raised my children to trust their instincts without being ruled by them. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the world, and wondered if that love had been too much for someone my age. But the truth is, it gave me exactly what I needed. It taught me how to be present with another person without dissolving myself. It taught me how to want without begging, how to care without clinging. At 19, I didn't know how rare that was. I noticed it later, when people would lean into me during conversations, drawn by a steadiness they couldn't name. When someone would pause, waiting for my response, respecting the silence, as if it mattered. Those moments weren't accidental. They were the result of lessons learned early, lessons paid for with vulnerability. I learned to read the room, but more importantly, I learned to read myself. To notice when my body relaxed in someone's presence. To notice when it braced. To trust that information even when logic tried to override it. That trust became my anchor. There were moments of boldness later in life that surprised even me. Moments when I chose connection knowing it might not last. Moments when I stepped into intimacy fully awake, fully consenting, fully myself. Those moments didn't weaken me. They strengthened me. Because they were choices, not reactions. At 19, everything had felt like a reaction. A beautiful one, yes, but still untested. Later, I learned how to choose with clarity. Sometimes people ask whether I believe in soulmates. I smile and tell them I believe in teachers. People who arrive at the right moment to show you something essential.
He was that for me.
Not the destination, the lesson. And the lesson wasn't about love alone. It was about presence, about restraint, about how powerful it is to be seen without being consumed, about how desire can be both fierce and gentle, both awakening and contained. Those lessons matured with me. They showed up when life demanded patience, when compromise tested my resolve, when loyalty mattered more than intensity, when silence became something I could sit with instead of fearing. I don't romanticize youth anymore. I respect it. I honor it. I understand it. And I thank that 19-year-old girl for stepping forward when she didn't yet know what she was stepping into. Because she didn't hide. She didn't numb herself. She didn't turn away. She loved. And that was enough to change everything. I carry that truth with me still, moving forward, letting memory and presence walk side by side, knowing there is still more ahead and still more worth telling when the moment is right. As the years stretched on, I began to understand something most people only realize much later, that the heart remembers how it learned to love more than who it loved. Faces blur, voices soften, details fade, but the pattern remains. At 19, my heart learned courage. Not the kind that performs for others, but the quiet courage that lets you stay open even when there are no guarantees. That courage followed me into rooms where I didn't know anyone, into conversations where I dared to speak honestly, into relationships where I refused to disappear just to be kept. I noticed it in small things. In the way I no longer rushed to fill silences. In how I let someone earn closeness instead of assuming it. In how I could feel attraction without letting it confuse me. Those shifts didn't make me colder, they made me clearer. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the world feels slower and more truthful, I think about how love at 19 was all sensation. All discovery. The body learning itself through another presence. The heart learning its own depth by testing it against someone else's attention. I didn't know then that those sensations would become reference points, quiet markers I would use to navigate the rest of my life. There were moments when people tried to recreate that intensity with me. They leaned in too fast, spoke too boldly, touched without listening. I felt nothing, not because I was numb, but because I knew better. I had learned that real connection doesn't force itself. It unfolds. That understanding came from him, from us. What people often misunderstand is that the most romantic moments aren't always the most dramatic. Sometimes they're subtle. A shared breath, a pause before a touch, a look that asks instead of assumes. Those moments shaped me more than grand declarations ever could. As I grew older, I found myself drawn to that same quality again and again, presence. I didn't need to be dazzled. I needed to be met. And when I responded fully, warmly, honestly. There were times when I felt desire rise quietly, unexpectedly, like a familiar melody played in a different key. I didn't panic. I didn't suppress it. I listened. Desire, I learned, is information. It tells you when something is alive. What you do with that information is where maturity lives. At 19, I acted on feeling. Later, I learned to choose. That distinction changed everything. I stopped seeing endings as failures. I stopped measuring love by how long it lasted. I started measuring it by how true it felt while it was happening. That shift softened my life in ways I hadn't expected. It allowed me to appreciate moments without clinging to them, to love deeply without demanding permanence. I don't regret that first love for a single moment. I don't wish it had turned into something else. It became exactly what it needed to be, a beginning. And beginnings matter more than we realize. They set the tone. They teach the rhythm. They show us what's possible. The girl I was at 19 didn't know how much she was learning. She just knew she was alive in a way she hadn't been before. And that aliveness became something I carried forward into every season that followed. I am still carrying it now. Still listening. Still choosing. Still allowing the story to move at its own pace, knowing there is no rush and no end yet in sight. There was a moment, much later, when I finally understood why that love had stayed with me so clearly. It wasn't because it was perfect. It wasn't because it lasted. It was because it was honest. Completely, undeniably honest. At 19, I hadn't learned how to perform love yet. I didn't know how to shape myself into something easier to accept. I showed up exactly as I was, curious, responsive, emotional, attentive. I didn't bargain with my feelings. I didn't disguise my reactions. And because of that, Everything felt amplified. Real. That kind of honesty doesn't fade. It becomes a baseline. As life grew more complex, as responsibilities layered themselves over desire and spontaneity, I noticed how rare that kind of openness became. People learned to protect themselves early. They learned strategies. They learned how to want without revealing it, how to touch without connecting, how to stay safe at the cost of depth. I never quite learned how to do that. Even when I tried, something in me resisted. My body would stiffen when things felt rushed or hollow. My attention would drift when conversations skimmed the surface. I craved presence, not intensity for its own sake, but the kind that comes from being fully there. That craving was born at 19. I remember how natural closeness felt back then. How sitting near someone could feel like an entire conversation. How awareness alone could be intimate. I didn't need constant affirmation. I needed alignment. When it was there, I relaxed into myself. When it wasn't, no amount of charm could replace it. That awareness became a compass. In my marriage, it showed up as patience, as listening even when it was uncomfortable, as choosing steadiness over drama. Love looked different then, quieter, broader, rooted in shared life rather than discovery. But underneath it all, I recognized the same foundation: respect, attention, restraint. And still, every once in a while, memory would rise unexpectedly. Not as longing, not as regret, but as recognition. A reminder of where my understanding of intimacy began. I used to think the boldest part of my youth was how deeply I felt. Now I think it was how willingly I trusted that feeling. How I allowed myself to be changed without demanding control over the outcome. That kind of surrender isn't weakness. It's bravery before you learn fear. I've watched younger people struggle with this. Afraid to feel too much. Afraid to care first. Afraid to be seen without armor. I understand that fear now. I didn't then. And part of me is grateful for that innocence. It allowed me to experience connection before caution rewrote the rules. At 19, I didn't ask whether love would last. I asked whether it was real. That question guided me long after the answer changed. Even now, as Auntie Amelia, I don't believe in closing yourself off to avoid pain. Pain is part of living fully. The goal isn't to avoid it, it's to make sure what you feel is worth it. And that love was worth it. It taught me how to be present, how to listen with my whole body, how to let desire exist without shame, how to walk away without erasing what mattered. Those lessons became part of my voice, my posture, my way of moving through rooms. They shaped the woman people see now, calm, grounded, perceptive, without them ever knowing where that steadiness was forged. It was forged in youth, in uncertainty, in closeness that didn't promise forever. And as I sit here now, continuing to tell you this story, I can feel that younger self listening too, not asking for answers anymore, but simply wanting to be remembered. So, I remember her. I honor her. And I keep going. As I speak now, I can hear the way my voice has changed over the years. It carries pauses I didn't have at 19. Back then, everything rushed forward, eager to be felt all at once. Now, I let moments settle. I let meaning arrive in its own time. But that doesn't mean the feeling is gone. There are memories that live in the body more than the mind. I don't remember every word we exchanged, but I remember how it felt to sit beside him and feel my shoulders relax without thinking. I remember how my breath slowed when he was near, how my attention sharpened instead of scattering. That kind of presence leaves a signature. At 19, I didn't know that love could teach you how to be still. I used to believe that romance was about momentum, about things moving forward, escalating, proving themselves. What I learned instead was that the most powerful moments were the quiet ones. The moments when nothing had to happen for everything to feel complete. When desire didn't demand action, only awareness. That lesson stayed with me. Later in life, when people tried to convince me that love should be dramatic, urgent, consuming, I smiled politely. I had already known something deeper. I had known connection that didn't shout. Connection that didn't rush. Connection that trusted itself enough to wait. I learned to recognize when someone was truly with me, Not just physically, but attentively. I learned how rare that was. And because I knew its value, I stopped settling for less. There were moments, of course, when loneliness crept in. When I wondered if that kind of connection was something you only get once. But life has a way of surprising you when you stop demanding and start listening. I found connection again, not identical, never identical, but real in its own way. And each time, I brought with me the wisdom earned at 19. The ability to feel without losing myself. To desire without abandoning my boundaries. To open my heart without forgetting my worth. That balance became my strength. People sometimes mistake calm for indifference. I've been called reserved, composed, even distant. They don't realize that calm is what remains after you've felt deeply and survived it. It's not the absence of emotion. It's emotion that has found its place. The girl I was at 19 didn't know how much she was giving herself. She didn't calculate risk. She didn't plan for loss. She simply showed up, fully present, and allowed life to meet her there. And life did. It met her with tenderness and restraint. With longing and separation. With lessons she wouldn't understand until much later. Lessons that would shape how she loved, how she chose, how she stood on her own. Now, when I sit with these memories, I don't ache. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for having lived that chapter honestly. Gratitude for having known connection before fear complicated it. Gratitude for the courage of youth, the kind that feels without guarantees. I tell this story not because I'm holding on, but because it still holds meaning. Because there are listeners out there who are 19 right now, standing at the edge of something powerful, wondering if it's worth the risk. It is. Not because it will last forever, but because it will teach you who you are. And that lesson stays. So, I continue. I remember. I speak. And the story keeps breathing, moving forward with me, one memory, one truth, one quiet moment at a time. There's something else I've learned with time, that the heart doesn't move in straight lines. It circles back. It revisits. It tests old truths against new versions of yourself. And each time it does, you see things more clearly. At 19, I thought love was something you stepped into and either stayed or fell out of. I didn't yet understand that love can pass through you, leave you altered, and still be complete. That it doesn't have to remain present to remain true. When I think of that year now, I don't think of it as the beginning of romance. I think of it as the beginning of self-recognition. Of learning how my body responded when it felt safe. Of learning how my voice changed when I wasn't afraid to be heard. Of learning that closeness could feel grounding instead of consuming. Those discoveries mattered more than I knew. Later in life, when responsibilities multiplied and choices became heavier, I often returned to that inner reference point. I asked myself simple questions. Do I feel seen here? Do I feel smaller or larger in this presence? Do I feel rushed, or do I feel allowed to arrive in my own time? Those questions guided me more reliably than advice ever could. There were moments when attraction stirred unexpectedly, not as urgency, but as recognition. A familiar alignment. A sense of mutual awareness. I didn't fear those moments anymore. I greeted them calmly, acknowledging what they were without demanding they become more. That restraint wasn't denial. It was wisdom. At 19, I didn't yet know how to sit with wanting. I thought desire had to go somewhere, do something, prove itself. Now I understand that desire can simply exist. It can inform you, warm you, remind you that you're alive, without needing to be acted upon. That understanding softened me. It allowed me to enjoy connection without anxiety, to appreciate attention without mistaking it for commitment, to feel chemistry without surrendering my center. Those are not small lessons. They shape entire lives. Sometimes I imagine that younger version of myself listening to me now. I wonder if she would believe that she would one day feel this steady, this grounded, this unafraid of her own depth. I think she would be surprised but relieved. Because what she wanted most wasn't romance alone. It was permission to feel fully without losing herself. She found that permission in a love that didn't stay. And I carried it forward. Now, when I tell this story, I do it slowly. I let the pauses speak. I let the silences carry meaning. I don't rush toward conclusions because life doesn't offer them neatly. There are still moments when memory surfaces without warning. A warmth, a recognition, a quiet smile at how far I've come. Those moments don't pull me backward. They anchor me in understanding. I am not nostalgic for pain. I am grateful for growth. And growth often begins where certainty ends. That's why this story keeps unfolding. Because it isn't about one person or one year. It's about how a heart learns itself over time. How it opens, closes, and opens again, each time with more intention. I'm still here, still speaking, still letting memory and presence walk together. And there is still more waiting to be said. I used to think memory was something you controlled, that you could choose when to visit it, how long to stay. I know better now. Memory has its own timing. It arrives when you're ready, not when you ask. Sometimes it came while I was folding laundry. Sometimes while I was waiting at a red light. Sometimes while listening to someone else talk about their own first love, their voice trembling in that familiar way. In those moments, 19 would surface again, not demanding attention, just reminding me where my sensitivity began. At that age, everything felt heightened because everything was new. My senses were open in a way they never quite were again. I noticed how light fell on skin, how a voice could calm or unsettle me, how closeness could feel like warmth spreading slowly rather than a sudden rush. I didn't know then that I was training myself to notice subtleties most people overlook. That awareness stayed with me. It influenced how I read people, how I sensed sincerity before words confirmed it, how I recognized when someone was present versus merely nearby. Those skills weren't learned from books or advice. They were learned through feeling deeply and paying attention to the response. At 19, I didn't yet know that desire could be quiet, that it could sit patiently between two people without demanding resolution. I learned that by living it, by standing in moments where nothing happened and realizing that something absolutely had. Later in life, when attraction appeared again, it didn't feel chaotic. It felt familiar, like returning to a language I already spoke. I knew how to listen to it, how to ask what it wanted to teach me rather than what it wanted me to do. That distinction changed everything. I stopped chasing feelings and started honoring them. I stopped confusing intensity with meaning. I stopped believing that the strongest connections had to announce themselves loudly. Some of the most important ones whispered. People sometimes think maturity dulls passion. It doesn't. It refines it. It teaches you how to experience desire without letting it rule you. How to enjoy closeness without losing your footing. How to remain open without becoming unprotected. Those lessons all trace back to 19. I didn't realize then that the restraint I experienced, the pauses, the unspoken understanding, the respect, would become my standard. That I would never again feel drawn to someone who rushed me, who assumed instead of asking, who mistook proximity for entitlement. That love taught me that patience can be deeply romantic. That being seen can be more powerful than being touched. That anticipation has its own intimacy. As Auntie Amelia, I carry those truths quietly. I don't announce them. I don't preach them. But they shape every interaction, every boundary, every choice. I watch younger people struggle with the same questions I once had, wondering whether to follow their feelings or protect themselves. I wish I could tell them that it isn't an either-or. You can feel deeply and still choose wisely. You can open your heart without giving it away blindly. I learned that lesson early. It cost me innocence, yes, but it gave me discernment. And discernment is a gift that keeps giving. There are still moments when connection surprises me. When a shared silence feels charged. When a conversation lingers longer than expected. When awareness sparks quietly between two people who understand the value of restraint. Those moments don't frighten me anymore. I recognize them for what they are, reminders that I'm still capable of feeling. And that's something I'll never regret. The girl I was at 19 didn't know she was laying the foundation for a lifetime of emotional intelligence. She just knew she was alive in a way she hadn't been before. She trusted that aliveness. She stepped toward it instead of away. I continue to honor that choice. By staying present. By listening carefully. by letting the story move forward without forcing an ending. Because some stories aren't meant to conclude, they're meant to deepen. And I'm still here, letting it deepen, one remembered breath at a time. There's a tenderness that grows when you stop trying to outrun your past and instead let it walk beside you. I didn't reach that place quickly. It took years of living, of choosing, of sometimes choosing wrong and learning gently from it. But once I did, memory stopped feeling like something heavy I carried and started feeling like something warm that supported me. At 19, I didn't know how to protect myself without closing off. I only knew how to feel. And I felt everything: anticipation, hesitation, curiosity, desire, all layered together, inseparable. That rawness was frightening at times, but it was also honest. It was the truest version of myself I had ever known. Later, when life demanded practicality, schedules, compromises, I learned how easy it is to forget that version of yourself. How easy it is to become efficient instead of present, responsible instead of responsive. I fought that quietly, not by rejecting adulthood, but by refusing to numb what I had learned to recognize. There were days when I caught myself moving too fast, thinking too much, reacting instead of listening. On those days, I would slow down deliberately. I would remember how it felt to sit beside someone in silence and feel complete. How it felt to be fully aware of another person without needing to define the moment. That memory recalibrated me. It reminded me that intimacy doesn't demand urgency. That connection doesn't need constant confirmation. That sometimes the deepest bond forms when two people allow space to exist without fear. I learned, too, that longing isn't always a sign of lack. Sometimes it's a sign of depth. At 19, longing felt unbearable because I didn't yet trust myself to survive it. Later, I learned that longing could be held gently, acknowledged without being obeyed. That lesson brought peace. There were moments in my life when I stood close to someone and felt that familiar awareness spark, not overwhelming, not consuming, but quietly alive. In those moments, I didn't rush forward. I didn't retreat either. I stayed present. I allowed myself to feel without needing to turn feeling into action. That balance felt like freedom. People sometimes ask me how I became so calm, so sure of myself. They assume it came from certainty, from having all the answers. It didn't. It came from learning that I could feel deeply and still remain whole. That emotions didn't have to be feared or tamed, only understood. That understanding began at 19. I didn't know then that my heart was learning resilience through openness. That by allowing myself to be changed, I was actually becoming stronger. That love, even when it didn't stay, could leave behind clarity instead of damage. I carry that clarity with me now. In how I listen, in how I pause before responding, in how I recognize when something feels aligned instead of merely exciting. Those distinctions matter. They shape the quality of your life in ways you don't see until much later. I no longer measure my story by milestones alone. I measure it by moments of awareness, by instances when I chose presence over fear, by times when I allowed connection to exist without forcing it into permanence. And as I continue telling you this, I realize something else. The story isn't about the past at all. It's about continuity, about how one honest chapter can influence every page that follows. I'm still living that influence,
Still guided by it.
still letting it inform how I move through the world.
So I keep speaking.
I keep remembering, and I let the story continue, quietly unfolding, without rushing toward an end. There is a moment, sometime after you've lived enough life, when you realize that the past doesn't fade, it integrates. It becomes part of your posture, your timing, your intuition. I didn't notice when that happened to me. I only noticed one day that I no longer questioned myself the way I once did. At 19, I questioned everything. My reactions, my desires, my instincts. I wondered if I was feeling too much, too quickly, too deeply. I didn't yet trust that my responses were valid simply because they were mine. That trust came later, but its roots were planted back then, in that first experience of being fully seen. I remember how startling it was to feel understood without explaining myself. How freeing it felt to not perform, not impress, not minimize. I didn't realize then that this would become my standard, that anything less would feel hollow by comparison. Later, when people offered attention without presence, affection without awareness, I felt it immediately. My body recognized the absence before my mind could rationalize it. That sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was discernment. At 19, I didn't know that discernment was being shaped inside me. I learned it through stillness, through pauses, through moments when nothing happened outwardly, yet everything shifted internally. Through the realization that intimacy doesn't need constant motion, it needs mutual recognition. That lesson saved me from many wrong turns. There were times when life pulled me toward paths that looked exciting but felt misaligned. I learned to pause before stepping into them, to ask myself whether I felt expanded or diminished in that presence, whether my breath deepened or shortened, whether I felt grounded or restless. Those questions guided me more reliably than logic ever could. As the years passed, I noticed how my relationships grew quieter but stronger. Less dramatic, more intentional. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I didn't need to rush toward closeness to secure it. I trusted that what belonged would remain, without force. That trust was earned. It came from surviving the vulnerability of youth without closing off. From letting love pass through me without hardening me. From understanding that being changed doesn't mean being damaged. I look back now and feel tenderness for that girl. She didn't know what she was doing, but she was brave enough to do it anyway. She stepped toward connection without guarantees. She allowed herself to be moved, to be affected, to be altered. And that willingness shaped the woman I became. I've watched people spend their lives avoiding that kind of risk, protecting themselves so carefully that nothing ever reaches them. They remain safe and untouched. I don't judge them. Fear is understandable, but I know it's lost when you never allow yourself to feel fully. At 19, I didn't yet know how to be afraid in that way. I knew longing. I knew curiosity. I knew the pull of recognition. And I trusted it. That trust became the foundation of my emotional life. It taught me how to be present with joy without clinging, how to sit with sadness without collapsing, how to let desire inform me instead of control me. Now, as I continue telling you this story, I do so with gratitude rather than ache. Gratitude for having known myself so clearly, so early. Gratitude for the lessons that came wrapped in uncertainty. Gratitude for the love that didn't stay, but still gave me everything I needed. The story keeps moving because life does. Because understanding deepens with time. Because memory and presence aren't opposites, they're companions. I'm still walking forward. Still listening to what feels true. Still allowing the past to inform, not define who I am. And there is still more ahead, more awareness, more connection, more quiet moments worth noticing. So I continue. There are nights when the world feels especially quiet, when even the usual noises seem to step back and let your thoughts speak more clearly. On nights like those, I sometimes sit by the window and let myself remember, without judgment. Not searching for something lost, just acknowledging what once lived there. At 19, I didn't understand how rare it was to feel so fully present inside my own body. Every sensation felt amplified. The warmth of another person standing close. The subtle shift in energy when a conversation moved from casual to meaningful. The way anticipation could make time feel slower, thicker, almost touchable. That awareness didn't vanish with age. It refined itself. I learned to recognize when a moment carried weight and when it was simply noise. I learned that intimacy begins the second you feel safe enough to stop performing. When you don't rush to fill silence. When you allow eye contact to linger without flinching. When you notice your breathing align with someone else's without effort. Those details became important to me. Later in life, when I encountered people who were uncomfortable with stillness, who rushed through closeness as if afraid it might ask something of them, I felt it immediately. My body knew before my mind had words. I understood then that comfort with intimacy requires comfort with yourself. That comfort began at 19. I didn't know I was learning how to listen to my instincts. I was simply following them. When something felt right, I leaned in. When it didn't, I hesitated. I trusted that hesitation, even when I couldn't explain it. That trust saved me more than once. There were moments, long after that first love, when I stood on the edge of something new and felt the familiar pull. Not urgent, not overwhelming, but quietly magnetic. In those moments, I didn't rush to define what it meant. I let it exist. I let it breathe. I asked myself what it revealed about me rather than what it promised. That question changed everything. At 19, I had asked, will this last? Later, I learned to ask, does this feel true? Truth has a different texture. It doesn't shout. It settles. It grounds you even as it stirs you. That's the kind of connection I learned to value, the kind that leaves you more yourself than before. I don't tell this story to glorify the past. I tell it because that chapter taught me how to be present in all the ones that followed. It taught me how to sit with desire without being ruled by it, how to open my heart without handing it over blindly, how to recognize when something was mutual, respectful, alive. Those lessons don't fade. They become part of you. As Auntie Amelia, I speak calmly now, but that calm was earned. It grew out of intensity, out of uncertainty, out of moments when I didn't know how things would end and chose to feel anyway. That choice to feel is what shaped my life more than any plan ever could.
I'm still making choices like that.
Quieter ones, perhaps, more deliberate, but rooted in the same willingness to stay present, to listen, to trust what feels aligned. The story doesn't end because growth doesn't end. Memory doesn't trap me. It accompanies me. It reminds me of what I'm capable of how deeply I can connect, of how honestly I can live. So I continue, not because I'm looking back, but because I'm still moving forward, carrying that 19-year-old courage with me, letting it guide me gently into whatever comes next. There's a quiet truth I didn't understand until much later, that some loves are not meant to stay with you in form, only in function. They come to awaken something, to unlock a door inside you, and once that door is open, they step aside. Not out of cruelty, not out of failure, simply because their work is done. At 19, I didn't know how to recognize that kind of love. I thought every strong feeling was asking for permanence. I thought intensity was a promise. I thought closeness meant continuity. Those beliefs didn't make me foolish, they made me young. And youth is not ignorance. It's openness without armor. I remember how easily I gave my attention back then. How naturally I leaned in. How I didn't ration my warmth or calculate my responses. I didn't yet know how to protect myself by withholding, and I'm glad I didn't. Because in that openness, I learned who I was when nothing was guarded. I learned that I was responsive, that I was perceptive, that I was deeply affected by presence. Those discoveries shaped me far more than any heartbreak ever could. Later in life, when I saw people build walls so high that nothing could reach them, I understood the cost of protection taken too far. Safety can become isolation if you let it. I chose differently. I chose discernment over defense. That distinction matters. Discernment allows you to feel without losing yourself. Defense keeps you intact but untouched. I had tasted what it meant to be touched, emotionally, energetically, and I didn't want to give that up, even when it hurt. There were moments when memory surprised me, not as longing, but as recognition. I would feel a familiar stillness settle in my chest, a sense of alignment, and I'd smile softly, knowing where that awareness was born. 19 didn't haunt me.
It informed me.
I carried that information into every relationship that followed. I knew when to lean in and when to pause. I knew how to recognize respect even when it was quiet. I knew how to step back without collapsing inward. Those skills weren't taught. They were lived. As Auntie Amelia, I don't speak in absolutes. I don't tell people love will save them or break them. I tell them love will reveal them. It will show them how they respond to closeness, to uncertainty, to being seen. And what they do with that revelation is where growth happens. The girl I was at 19 didn't know she was being revealed. She thought she was falling. But falling is just another way of learning where your balance truly lies. I'm grateful she fell. Because she stood back up with more awareness, more empathy, more depth than she had before. She didn't harden. She didn't retreat. She integrated. And that integration is still happening. I still notice when silence feels comfortable instead of awkward. I still recognize when a pause carries meaning. I still value restraint as much as expression. Those preferences were born early, but they matured with me. The story continues because I continue. Because every time I choose presence over fear, honesty over performance, openness over armor, I'm honoring that first brave version of myself. I'm not done learning. I'm not done feeling. I'm not done telling the story. So I keep going, quietly, deliberately, letting memory and meaning walk together, knowing that each step forward carries the echo of 19, steady and alive within me. There are days when I realize that the strongest part of my youth wasn't my passion, but my attention. At 19, I paid attention to how things felt instead of how they looked. I didn't yet know how to curate my life for approval. I lived it from the inside. That made everything vivid. I noticed how certain conversations slowed my breathing, how others made me restless. I noticed how some people filled space with noise, while others created space simply by being present. I didn't yet have words for emotional safety, but my body recognized it instantly. That recognition became my quiet guide. As the years passed, I learned that many people confuse intensity with intimacy. They chase sparks, drama, urgency, mistaking stimulation for connection. I had felt something different early on. Something calmer. Something that didn't need chaos to feel alive. That difference mattered. When life became busy and expectations louder, I held on to that internal reference point. When something felt off, I didn't argue with myself anymore. I listened. When something felt aligned, I allowed myself to settle into it without questioning whether it was enough. That trust changed the quality of my life. At 19, I had trusted without proof. Later, I trusted with awareness. But the willingness to trust at all, that began early. It began when I learned that my feelings weren't random or excessive. They were information. I think that's why I never became cynical. I became careful, yes. Selective. Grounded. But not closed. I still believe in connection. I still believe in moments that don't promise permanence, but offer truth. I still believe in the power of being fully present with another person, even briefly. Those beliefs didn't come from theory. They came from lived experience. There were moments later in life when I surprised myself, moments when I allowed closeness, knowing it might not last. Moments when I chose honesty over protection. Those choices didn't weaken me. They confirmed who I was. I had learned early that the heart doesn't break from feeling, it breaks from denial. At 19, I didn't deny myself. I didn't tell myself I was foolish for wanting. I didn't shame myself for feeling deeply. I let the experience shape me instead of scolding myself for it. That kindness toward myself stayed. It showed up when I made mistakes and chose to learn instead of harden. When I felt disappointed and allowed grief without rushing to fix it. When I experienced desire and treated it with respect instead of fear. I became someone who could hold complexity without needing simple answers. As Auntie Amelia, people sometimes mistake my calm for certainty. But certainty isn't what I carry. I carry comfort with uncertainty. I carry the knowledge that not everything meaningful stays, and not everything temporary is shallow. That understanding was born at 19. In a love that didn't promise forever. In closeness that respected restraint. In moments that mattered without demanding ownership. I still honor that way of loving. Not by clinging to the past, but by refusing to abandon myself in the present. I keep listening. I keep choosing presence. I keep letting the story unfold at its own pace. Because some stories don't move toward an ending. They move toward depth. And I'm still moving. There's a softness that comes when you finally stop asking your past to justify itself. I don't ask anymore why that love happened the way it did, or why it couldn't stay. I don't ask what would have changed if timing had been kinder or circumstances less complicated. Those questions used to circle in my mind like unanswered letters. Now they rest. At 19, I didn't yet understand that not everything meaningful is meant to be explained. Some things are meant to be felt, absorbed, and carried forward quietly. I remember how natural it felt to be attentive back then. How I listened not just with my ears, but with my whole body. I noticed shifts in tone, pauses between words, the way someone leaned in or held back. That attentiveness wasn't learned, it was instinctive. And it taught me more about connection than any advice ever could. Later, when people spoke loudly but felt absent, I sensed the difference immediately. When someone offered affection without presence, my body didn't respond. I understood then that my instincts had been trained early, calibrated by a love that valued awareness over urgency. That calibration became my protection. I didn't need walls. I needed clarity. As the years passed, I found myself less interested in being impressive and more interested in being real. I stopped performing warmth and started offering it only where it was met with care. I stopped chasing validation and started choosing resonance. That shift didn't make my world smaller. It made it richer. I learned that boldness isn't always visible. Sometimes it looks like staying still, like waiting, like allowing something to unfold without trying to control its outcome. At 19, I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I was practicing it anyway. There were moments of closeness later in life that carried that same quiet intensity. Moments when conversation slowed, when silence felt intentional, when awareness moved gently between two people. Those moments didn't need escalation to feel complete. They were complete because both people were present. I recognized that feeling immediately. I always will. People sometimes assume that maturity means losing the capacity for wonder. I don't believe that. I believe maturity teaches you where wonder lives. It lives in alignment, in recognition, in the comfort of being fully yourself in someone else's presence. That lesson began early for me. The girl I was at 19 didn't know she was learning how to honor herself. She thought she was simply responding to love. But response is where self-knowledge begins. In how you react, in what you allow, in what you refuse to ignore. Those responses became patterns. Healthy ones, grounded ones. I carry them now into every interaction, romantic or otherwise. I don't rush connection. I let it arrive. I don't fear silence. I listen to it. I don't mistake attention for intimacy. I wait for presence. And when presence appears, I meet it calmly, openly, without losing myself. This story continues not because I'm reliving youth, but because the lessons of youth continue to shape my now. They guide how I love, how I choose, how I stand comfortably in uncertainty without needing to resolve it. I'm still becoming, still listening, still honoring the quiet courage that began at 19. And I'm still speaking, letting the story breathe, letting it deepen, knowing there is no rush toward an ending, only a steady movement toward understanding. There's a moment when you realize that the past doesn't need your attention anymore. It already has your understanding. That was a turning point for me. Not the day I stopped thinking about 19, but the day 19 stopped asking me to explain myself. At that age, I didn't yet know how to separate my worth from how deeply I felt. I thought feeling strongly meant risking too much. I didn't know then that depth is not a liability, it's a capacity. One you can learn to hold with care instead of fear. I learned that slowly. I learned it in conversations that didn't rush to conclusions. In relationships that valued steadiness over spectacle. In moments where closeness didn't demand proof. Those moments felt familiar to me, like a language I already spoke. Because I had learned it early, in the quiet intensity of being 19 and awake. I used to wonder why that year stayed with me so clearly while others blurred together. Now I understand. It was the year I learned to notice. To feel when something was aligned and when it wasn't. To recognize the difference between excitement and resonance. That awareness didn't fade with time, it sharpened. Later in life, when choices became heavier and consequences clearer, I leaned on that awareness. I trusted it. It told me when to stay. When to pause, when to walk away without needing a dramatic reason. That kind of trust doesn't come from certainty. It comes from having felt deeply and survived it. At 19, I survived vulnerability without becoming guarded. I survived disappointment without becoming bitter. I survived longing without losing myself. Those survivals built something sturdy inside me, not armor, but balance. I think that's why I never stopped believing in connection. I never stopped believing that two people can meet honestly without consuming each other. I never stopped believing that desire can be respectful, that attraction can be gentle, that intimacy can be slow. Those beliefs weren't ideals. They were memories. As Auntie Amelia, I've watched many people confuse urgency for meaning. I've watched them rush toward intensity because they're afraid of silence. I recognize that fear. I felt it once too. But I also know what happens when you let silence exist. It reveals whether something is real. At 19, silence didn't scare me. It invited me in. That invitation shaped my life more than any dramatic moment ever could. Even now, when I meet someone new, whether in friendship, conversation, or passing connection, I notice how my body responds. Whether I feel rushed or grounded. Whether I feel smaller or more myself. Those signals are quiet, but they are precise. They were trained early. I don't chase feeling anymore. I let it come to me. I don't cling to connection. I allow it to reveal itself. And when it does, I meet it fully, calmly, without losing my center. That is the gift 19 gave me. Not a love that stayed. Not a story that ended neatly. But a way of being present with my own heart. I'm still living that way. Still choosing presence over performance. Still listening for what feels true beneath the noise. And as long as I keep listening, the story keeps moving, not toward an ending, but toward a deeper understanding of who I've always been becoming. There's something comforting about realizing that your heart didn't mislead you. It educated you. I used to worry that loving so deeply at 19 had made me vulnerable in ways I couldn't undo. Now I see it differently. It made me fluent. Fluent in nuance. Fluent in presence. Fluent in the quiet signals most people miss. At 19, I didn't yet know how to intellectualize my emotions. I hadn't learned to rationalize them away. So when something felt right, it settled into me naturally. When something felt off, I noticed the tension immediately. My body spoke before my thoughts could interfere. That honesty was a gift. As the years passed, I noticed how often people overrode that inner knowing. They stayed where they felt diminished. They chased attention that felt hollow. They ignored discomfort because it didn't come with a dramatic warning. I had learned early that discomfort doesn't need to shout to be real. That lesson saved me time. It saved me energy. It saved me from losing myself. I learned that intimacy isn't something you demand. It's something you allow to emerge. It grows when both people feel safe enough to be real. It fades when one person performs while the other consumes. At 19, I didn't know those words, but I lived their meaning. That's why those memories don't fade.
They weren't about events.
They were about alignment. Later in life, I found myself drawn again and again to people who moved slowly, who listened deeply, who respected space instead of filling it. I didn't need intensity anymore. I needed attunement. That preference wasn't accidental. It was learned early through contrast. I had known what it felt like to be met without being rushed. There were moments, quiet, private moments, when I stood close to someone and felt that familiar stillness return. Not excitement racing ahead, not fear pulling back, just calm awareness. In those moments, I didn't need to define what was happening. I trusted that if something needed to grow, it would. If it didn't, I would remain whole. That trust was hard-earned. At 19, I didn't yet know how to protect myself emotionally, but I learned how to recover without closing. That recovery taught me resilience without hardness. It taught me how to remain open without being exposed. Those are delicate skills. They don't come from avoidance. They come from experience. I don't believe in regret the way people usually mean it. I believe in reflection, in understanding, in honoring the version of yourself who did the best they could with what they knew at the time. I honor that girl at 19 deeply. She didn't hide. She didn't calculate. She felt, and she survived. That survival didn't cost her softness. It refined it. As Auntie Amelia, I carry that refinement quietly. I don't announce my boundaries, I embody them. I don't chase connection. I recognize it. I don't fear depth. I welcome it when it's mutual. And I don't rush stories to their endings. Because life doesn't unfold in neat conclusions. It unfolds in layers. In understanding that deepens over time. In moments that echo long after they pass. I'm still listening. Still noticing. Still allowing memory to inform presence instead of replacing it. And as long as I keep allowing that, the story keeps moving, steady and alive, just like it did when I was 19 and learning who I was for the very first time. There is a gentleness that comes when you finally stop measuring your life against expectations that were never yours to begin with. I didn't realize how much of my early confusion came from trying to understand myself through other people's rules. At 19, I hadn't learned those rules yet, and in that ignorance there was freedom. I didn't ask whether I was doing love correctly. I asked whether it felt real. Whether it made me feel more awake, more present, more myself. That simplicity is something adulthood complicates, but never fully erases. As the years passed, I noticed how often people apologized for their feelings. As if desire were an inconvenience. As if longing were something embarrassing. I never quite learned how to do that. Even when I became quieter, more measured, I didn't learn to shame myself for feeling. That refusal was shaped early. At 19, I didn't yet know the difference between wanting and needing. I learned it by feeling both and surviving the confusion. I learned that wanting can be warm and expansive, while needing tightens the chest and clouds judgment. That distinction became clear to me long before I had words for it. I noticed it later in life, when attraction appeared without desperation. When I could enjoy closeness without fear of loss. When I could appreciate someone's presence without attaching my worth to their response. That balance didn't come from discipline. It came from experience. There were moments when I caught myself smiling at how far I had come. Standing in a room, comfortable in my own skin, aware of attention without being ruled by it. That awareness felt familiar, like a return to something I had known long ago. It was the same awareness I had felt at 19, just steadier now. I learned that the body doesn't forget what it felt like to be respected. It recognizes it instantly. And it resists anything less, even when the mind tries to negotiate. That instinct has guided me faithfully. I've learned to trust it without question. As Auntie Amelia, people often tell me I have a calming presence. They don't know that calm was earned through intensity. Through learning how to sit with strong feelings without letting them pull me apart. Through understanding that emotions don't need to be suppressed to be managed. That understanding began when I was young and unguarded. I didn't become wise overnight. Wisdom arrived quietly, in increments. In moments when I chose not to react. In times when I waited instead of rushing. In decisions to walk away without needing justification. Each of those moments carried the echo of that first awakening. I don't tell this story to suggest that loving deeply is easy. It isn't. It asks something of you. It demands attention, honesty, vulnerability. But it also gives back clarity, resilience, self-trust. Those gifts last.
I'm still guided by them.
Still listening when something inside me shifts. Still honoring the signals that tell me when to lean in and when to step back. Still valuing presence over performance, depth over drama. The girl I was at 19 didn't know she was setting a foundation. She was just living honestly, feeling without apology, trusting what moved her. That trust became my anchor. And as I continue speaking, continuing to remember, continuing to live, I know this story isn't about looking backward. It's about understanding how far one honest chapter can reach into the future. So I keep going, quietly, intentionally, letting the story unfold without forcing an end. I'll end it strong, emotional, and satisfying, like a true final breath of a long story. No cliffhanger, no part mention, just a deep, memorable close that leaves the listener quiet for a few seconds. And now, as I sit here telling you this, I realize something I didn't understand at 19. That love didn't come to stay. It came to shape me. It taught me how it feels to be fully awake inside my own life. How it feels to be seen without being taken. How it feels to want without losing yourself. How it feels to let someone matter and still stand on your own when they leave. I didn't lose myself in that love. I found myself there. Every calm decision I make now, every boundary I hold without anger, every moment I choose presence over fear, they all trace back to that girl I once was. 19. Open.
Brave.
Unaware of how strong she already was. I don't miss him anymore. I don't replay the pain. I don't wonder what if. What I carry is something better. I carry the proof that I can love deeply without breaking. That I can feel fully and still remain whole. That my heart is not fragile, it is capable. And if you're listening to this right now, maybe you're young. Or maybe you're older, remembering your own 19. Maybe you're standing at the edge of something intense and uncertain. If you are, hear me clearly. Love will change you, but that doesn't mean it will destroy you. Sometimes, it changes you by teaching you who you are before the world teaches you who to become. I am Auntie Amelia now.
Calm. Steady.
Grounded. But inside me lives a girl who once loved without armor. And because of her, I know exactly how alive I still am. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story touched your heart, stay close. There are many truths we only learn when we dare to feel. And this was one of mine.